Page 23. Are we there? Okay. So let's read it. Now, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him pleading with him, saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, dreadfully tormented." And Jesus said to him, "I will come and heal him." The centurion answered him and said, "Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority and have soldiers under me. And I say to this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to those who followed, "Assuredly, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And I say to you that many will come from east and west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go your way as you have believed, so let it be done for you." And his servant was healed that same hour. Now when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, saying, "He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses." So we're dealing today with three different pericopes. One, the centurion's servant. Second, Peter's mother. And third, a demon-possessed person. So 2 points I'd like to bring to our attention are, first, Jesus spoke the word, and the servant of the centurion was healed that same hour, as it says. This brings to us that the Jew, in this context, needs to learn that the passport of God's presence is not membership, it is faith. The centurion had faith, and therefore Christ recognized it and said to him, "Your servant's healed." Second, deals with Peter's mother. The gifts we receive from God should not be used as anything else other than service to others. We see his mother, as soon as she was healed, she rose and served Christ and those who were there. It is a selfless giving, a sacrifice, which is our calling. So first, now let's get into some depth with the centurion and some points that need to be made here. It's interesting to note that every centurion that is mentioned in the New Testament is mentioned with honor. But there's something very special about this centurion, and that was his attitude. His servant would be a slave, but the centurion was grieved that his servant was ill and demanded that he be healed. Now let's get into why that's an important idea. The Roman view of a slave. When we think of slaves, what do we think? They're nothing. That was very similar, or the exact same thing as what the Romans thought. This, the way the centurion felt, is complete opposite of the normal attitude of a master-slave relationship. In the Roman Empire, slaves did not matter. It was of no importance to anyone if they suffered and whether they lived or they died. Aristotle, talking about the friendships which are possible in life, writes, "There can be no friendship nor justice towards inanimate things, indeed not even towards a horse or an ox, nor yet towards a slave as a slave. For a master and a slave have nothing in common. A slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate object." A slave was no better than a thing. Gaius, the Roman legal expert, writes in his Institutes, "We may note that it is universally accepted that the master possesses the power of life and death over the slave." Varro, the Roman writer on agriculture, has a grim passage in which he divides the instruments of agriculture into three classes. The first of which is the articulate, second, the inarticulate, and the third being the mute. The only difference between a slave and a beast or a cart was that the slave could speak. So we see here, slaves are nothing. They are comparing it, there's nothing that can be compared to them because, as we learned in our American history, slaves were left to die and they were not cared for. So this was the same concept, the same ideal that the Roman, army thought about their slaves. So this centurion, it's quite clear that he was an extraordinary man because he loved his slave. I say he loved his slave. Why? He wanted his slave healed. And it might be well that it was his totally universal and unexpected gentleness and love which Jesus was so moved when the centurion first came to him. Not only was the centurion extraordinary in his attitude towards his servant, but he was also a man extraordinary in faith. So now this is a second idea. Faith. He wanted Christ to heal his slave. He was looking for Christ, whom he recognized and knew could heal. His care for his slave, his compassion for his slave, was that so he was looking for the person who could save his slave. And Christ asked him, "Am I to come and heal him?" And it's this statement which tests the centurion's faith, and by his answer we see his extraordinary faith. And this is where we see his faith, for as a soldier he knew well what it was to give a command. As we saw, he says to his slave, "Go," and he goes, and "Come," and he comes. So he knew what it was to give a command and have that command instantly and unquestionably answered, carried out. So he said to Christ, his answer, "You do not need to come to my house. I am not fit for you to enter my house. All you have to do is to speak the word of command, and that command will be obeyed." It is this statement in which speaks the centurion's faith. And it is here where Christ lays down that passport to the blessedness of God. The passport to the kingdom is through faith. Our faith is our diavatirio. I learned that word very well. Our diavatirio, it's our passport to God. Now we see the image of the banquet. Verses 10, it begins, and it goes to about 12. It's the imagery of the banquet. The Jews believed when the Messiah came, there would be a great banquet in which all Jews would sit down and feast. So Christ was talking to this point. They looked forward to it with all their hearts, but it never crossed their minds that any Gentile would sit down at it. And we see this in Isaiah chapter 60, verse 12. The nation, quote Isaiah here, "The nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish." We're talking about service here, at least in Peter's eyes. The following pericope. We're going back and forth here. "The nation and kingdom that will not serve you shall perish. Those nations shall be utterly laid waste." Yet here is Jesus saying that many shall come from the east and from the west and sit down at this banquet. Still worse, Christ says that many of the sons of the kingdom will be shut out. This to the Jews is crazy talk because they're expecting this banquet. To the Jew, the extraordinary and the shattering thing about all this was that the Gentile, whom he expected to be absolutely shut out, was to be a guest at this messianic banquet, and the Jew whom he expected to be welcomed with open arms is to be shut out into the outer darkness. The tables were to be turned and all expectations were to be reversed. So we see that the Jews were expectant of this banquet, yet possibly did not have to do anything to inherit this banquet. Yet the Gentiles, out of their service, are the ones who are going to be called and be granted the gift to sit at this banquet. What does that mean for us today? Let's make that comparison. How often do we feel entitled to things? How often do we feel entitled to things? No matter what our background is, which could, let's say, possibly dictate the ways we think. How often do we feel entitled to things that we don't work for? How often are we spoiled by the things that we have and realize or don't realize what it is not to have these things? Are we then able and given the gift to sit at this banquet which is to come? Are we the Jews or are we the Gentiles? Just like us, the Jews had to learn that the passports to God's presence is not membership of any nation, but it is of faith. Now, verses 14 to about 18, powers over all infirmities, healings, and exorcisms. When we compare Mark's narrative of events with that of Matthew, we see that this incident happens in Capernaum on a Sabbath day. Now remember, the Sabbath, you can't do anything. After Jesus worshipped in the synagogue. So he comes to Peter's house and he sees that his wife's mother was ill with a fever. All right, we all get fevers once in a while when we get sick, but why is this important, this fever? Well, fevers were common in Palestine. There were 3 types of fevers. The first was Malta fever, the second, intermittent fever, and the third, malaria. And it was most likely the third of these, malaria, which Peter's mother-in-law had. This miracle tells us some things about Christ. First, Christ had come from the synagogue. There he dealt with a demon-possessed man and cured him. This is in Mark 1, chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. And as Matthew has it, he helped the centurion's servant on the way home. So in both Mark and Matthew, Christ did something previously that day. So as Christ arrived at Peter's house, after being tired, looking for rest, yet found himself in demand of healing, found himself being asked for healing and help. In this instance, we see that there's no publicity, there's no crowd, no one's around him, just the 3 of them. Christ, Peter, and Peter, 4 of them. Christ, Peter, his wife, and his mother. It was a simple cottage, a poor woman tossing with a fever. That's all he found there. What we can take from this is Christ was never too tired to help. That's important to realize. In a crowd or a cottage, his love and his power were at the disposal of anyone who needed him. So we see Christ didn't say, hey, I'm tired, so I'm not going to heal her. I'm not going to wait till tomorrow. Give me some time. What did he do? He healed her. The miracle also tells us something about the person, Peter's mother-in-law, whom he healed. No sooner had he healed her than she busied herself in attending to their needs. Where does it say that? So he touched, in verse 15, so he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them. She clearly regards herself as saved to serve. Are we saved to serve as well? Or are we saved to be served? Again, going back to that idea of, what's the word? Assuming things that are not, let's say, rightfully ours. Things that we want, we take. Anyway, the word escapes me. It'll come back. So, what did Peter's mother-in-law do right away? She served. She got up and served with her newfound health. She wanted to serve and be of any use of them who were there in the house. And again, how do we use this gift? Our gift of health. Do we use it to serve others, or do we use it to serve ourselves? Now, Matthew 8:16, just a few verses down, we see here again that Jesus saw late in the day. Let's remind ourselves. When evening had come, this was after Peter's mother-in-law. When evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, saying, He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. So again, it was late in the day on the Sabbath. And we see here the distinction with evening. It was late in the evening. The reason that was said is because it was illegal for someone to be healed on the Sabbath. To carry a burden was anything which weighed more than 2 dried figs. So a burden was possibly this demon-possessed person. They were heavier. So it was illegal to carry a person to be healed on the Sabbath day. Therefore, it was after the Sabbath that the crowd waited until evening, knowing that was the time which Jesus could heal according to the law. So they waited until the time. Here we have to note again what Christ was doing that day. He had been in the synagogue. He had healed the demon-possessed man. He healed the centurion's servant. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. He preached and no doubt encountered those who were bitter to him in opposition. It was evening, and therefore we can assume Christ was tired. Why do we say that? He's human. Okay, so let's assume he was tired and that he might be expecting some rest. This passage calls to Matthew's mind the saying of Isaiah. So Matthew quotes Isaiah here, Isaiah 53, verse 4, where it is said of the servant of the Lord that he bore our weaknesses and carried our sins. For us, God willing, we are followers or disciples of Christ. We must keep in mind that we will find our weariness refreshed and our weaknesses strengthened in the service of others. Why have I been talking so much about Christ and what he did during that day, and assuming he was tired later in the day? It says it right here. Isaiah 53. He himself took our infirmities and bore our sicknesses. He was tired. He took our sicknesses. He took our difficulties, although he was tired. But in that we are refreshed, in that Christ was refreshed, that he continued to do his work. So why can't we be refreshed in the good works of our hands to those who are sick or are in need more than we are ourselves? It is for the service of others. Somehow, as the demons come through demands, our strength comes also. And somehow we will find that we are able to go on for the sake of others when we feel as if we cannot take another step for ourselves. Again, to recap, our passport to Christ is through our faith, and let's add to that, through our service. Not to be expectant of anything. And that if we can remember Peter's mother-in-law when we are sick and expect people to serve us, think of how much more joy we can attain if instead we use our sicknesses, our infirmities, our impediments, for service towards others. Imagine the joy we can receive. Because I guess we can see the joy that Peter's mother-in-law had when she immediately got up. She's healed, she's thankful, and served right away. Thank you.